Congressional committees were formed really in the first Congress, but they were what are called select committees. So they were set up basically to process a bill, and then they went away. Okay. One of the key institutional features of the House and the Senate is the standing committee. This is a committee that exists, was created to serve a particular role to deal with particular issues. It exists and has existed for typically a long period of time. The first standing committee in the House of Representatives was the House Ways and Means Committee. And it was formed at the end of the 18th century. It was formed essentially because Congress recognized that there was this really powerful Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, who had a lot of information and knowledge about the way in which the federal government was raising and spending its money. So committees are essential institutions for Congress because they provide key information about public policy, and in many ways they can serve as a check against the executive branch.
So committees are tremendously powerful in many cases. So for one thing, committees have jurisdiction over legislation in certain areas. So if I want to introduce a piece of legislation that deals with transportation, it's going to go to the Transportation Committee. And when it gets there, the committee chair has a tremendous amount of agenda setting power. If the committee chair doesn't schedule hearings on it or doesn't want it to get sent to a subcommittee that's going to schedule hearings or anything like that, 9 times out of 10, more than 9 times out of 10, the bill's just going to die. One of the things committees can do is serve as bill graveyards for bills they don't want to get passed. And members, especially savvy members of Congress, will think about that when they're drafting a bill. They will draft a bill in such a way as to try to avoid the jurisdiction of some committee they think will be unfriendly and steer it towards a committee they think might be more friendly, even if that means perhaps leaving something out of the bill that in another world they would have put into the bill. Committees also, of course, hold hearings, and those hearings are very important sources of oversight over the bureaucracy and the executive branch, and sometimes the judiciary as well. They're an opportunity to threaten bureaucrats, right? So if you're facing especially skeptical questions about some program, and the people you're facing them from are the appropriations subcommittee that has jurisdiction over you, maybe you back off because you know they control the purse strings. And so there's a tremendous amount of research about the fact that the bureaucracy is very responsive to who's on the appropriations committees. But even short of threatening to pull someone's funding, just the fact of grilling, the fact of sort of having to face that kind of unfriendly questioning can have a significant effect on how people do their jobs.
Committee chairs are probably the most influential individuals in determining whether or not a piece of legislation is going to make it to the floor or not. The committee chair is selected by the majority party. The two parties have slightly different procedures for how they choose their chairs, but generally speaking, they're looking for people who have longstanding service on that committee, for people who are loyal partisans, people who are willing to toe the party line, people who the leadership of the chamber can work with. And those individuals then will receive pieces of legislation that have been sent there by the Speaker of the House to be processed in that committee. And it is entirely up to the chair of that committee which pieces of legislation he or she would like to schedule. It is entirely up to the chair how long those hearings will be scheduled, if there is going to be a hearing. The chair controls the witness list, and the majority party will always have significantly greater numbers of witnesses than the minority party. I've been to hearings where there are 6 people on the panel, 5 of them are majority witnesses, and then there's the one person at the end who's like, well, I disagree. And that's the minority party's witness. All of the scheduling, all of the selection of people to participate in those hearings, all of that is handled through the committee chair. In the late 1990s, President Clinton nominated William Weld, who was the former governor of Massachusetts, to serve as ambassador to Mexico. And at the time, the Foreign Relations Committee was being chaired by Jesse Helms. And Jesse Helms was a Republican. Of course, Bill Weld was also a Republican, but he was a liberal Republican. He was a Massachusetts Republican. Jesse Helms was adamantly opposed to William Weld's nomination to be ambassador to Mexico, and he absolutely was refusing to hold a hearing. the time the ranking member on the committee was Joe Biden. Biden and the other members of the committee used a procedure to, in essence, force the committee chair to hold a hearing on Governor Weld's nomination. So Jesse Helms recognizes that he's lost, basically because parliamentary procedure required him to do this. He agrees to hold the hearing. It's scheduled for, noon on Tuesday. The hearing opens. He gavels it open. He says, we're having this hearing on Governor William Weld to be ambassador to Mexico. The hearing will conclude at 12:30. He then proceeded to make opening remarks of approximately 27 minutes, at which time he turned to Ranking Member Biden and said, would you like to add anything? Biden started to speak. Helms said, oh, look at the time, and he gavelled it closed, and that was the hearing on Bill Weld. And it's an example of the extent to which the chair of the committee has absolute control over whether a hearing is scheduled, and then even if he's forced to hold a hearing, on what the timing and the pacing and ultimately the outcome of that hearing is going to be.
Let's talk about what could happen to a bill when it gets to a committee, because this is pretty essential to understanding the lawmaking process. Each bill has a patron or a sponsor, and one of the important tactical steps that an advocate or a sponsor for a bill must do is to garner support for that bill. Right? So when a bill goes to committee, it's not uncommon for the sponsor of that bill to begin to lobby for the bill to move forward, assuming that they really genuinely are interested in moving the bill. In some cases, members of Congress will sponsor bills as a favor, essentially as an acknowledgement to a constituent or to a contributor or to a party, and they really are not all that interested in necessarily moving the bill, in which case they basically let the bill sit. They take credit for the fact that they've introduced the bill, but they're not going to work all that hard to get it passed through the committee. Most bills in committee die right there in committee. They don't get very far. It's absolutely crucial if a bill is going to move forward to gain the support of either the subcommittee chair, which has control over the bill, or the committee chair. That's absolutely crucial because they're going to decide, first of all, whether there should be any hearings on the bill, where you bring people in, experts from executive agencies or lobbying groups or citizens or industry officials to come in and discuss the content of the bill. This is a fundamental step in deliberating. Most bills never get a hearing, okay? They just sit there. But if a bill gets a hearing or a series of hearings, that's a way in which the committee can become informed about the potential effects of the bill. Assuming the bill gets a vote in a subcommittee, it goes through what's called a markup. And so the bill at that point is subjected to amendments. And here, interestingly enough, the minority party members of the bill and majority party members of the bill actually engage in quite a bit of dialogue and quite a bit of give and take over whether or not to add something or take something out of a bill in the form of an amendment. We call that a markup. And so if the bill gets through the markup phase from the subcommittee into the committee, it has a much greater chance of moving forward and getting to the full House.
But then there's also just the actual information forcing function, right? There have been plenty of really important issues in American history where a lot of information has come out about them that would not otherwise have come out as a result of congressional investigations, as a result of the use of the congressional subpoena power, the ability to call witnesses, the sort of staff that's dedicated to ferreting out this information. So congressional committee hearings have been tremendously useful in that regard. So I think they can be used in a lot of different ways, as a partisan cudgel, as a sort of bipartisan or nonpartisan attempt to actually learn more about an issue, or more frequently, both of the above, right? Often people whose ox is getting gored will say that a committee is just a bunch of partisan hacks, and the people who are conducting the hearings will say, no, we're impartial fact finders, and they're probably somewhere right in the middle.
Increasingly, the role of the committee has declined for important legislation, and the role of party has risen. And so if we look at important legislation over the last decade, like the Obamacare bill, really the committees were involved in hearings, and the chairs of the committees and maybe the chairs of the subcommittees were part of the partisan teams that would work with the White House and the Speaker and the Majority Leader to negotiate the framing of the bill. But most of the heavy legislative lifting was done informally through a process that was led by the party leaders in both chambers. Members of Congress complain about this, especially the junior members who are cut out of this process. But nonetheless, I think because of the heightened partisan world in which we're living right now, important legislation, whether it be healthcare or foreign policy or whatever, gets really worked on by the party committees, led by the party leaders, and then bills brought to the floor, maybe formally having gone to committees, but the important work having been done by the parties.